Well, everyone, the Google Pixel 3a has been out for a little bit of time now. It's been about 5 years, and I want to go ahead and make a re-review of this particular phone and see if it's still worth buying in 2024. Now, there are lots of great things to love about this phone, and there might be some things that I probably would look to kind of avoid buying this phone for in some ways, and we'll talk about that throughout this whole entire video. But if you want to go and pick up some iPhones or some phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description. You can get that from there, and you can help support the channel at the same exact time. Now, starting off with the exterior and the outside of this particular phone, the first thing you're going to have to kind of keep in mind is that the Google Pixel 3a was basically trying to be somewhat of a budget phone of the Pixel 3 of that year. And what was very interesting at this moment was that Google actually went through and kind of created an even better phone in some ways than their current generation of phone that they were actually making. The thing you have to keep in mind was that the year that this phone came out back in 2019, they had already made phones like the Google Pixel 3 and the Google Pixel 3 XL. And the fact that they had made those phones at the time was really interesting because this particular device in its own ways was basically better than the phone that was supposed to be the budget phone of that moment or the more expensive phone of that moment. So the Google Pixel 3a, like less than $400 at that moment, or less than even $300 in some ways, which was crazy, on the front had a 5.6-inch OLED display, was 1080p, so it was full HD, and it did look pretty good. It was a good-looking phone with a very good-looking panel at that moment. It was a 1080p display at that as well, which was another very crazy thing going on for this particular iPhone. And I do think at that moment that was a very crazy thing going on here. And I really love this phone because of that kind of stuff. Now, the panel itself was great. It's a 60 Hz panel, so there's not anything super crazy going on with it. But I do think for the most part, for Samsung kind of making, or for Google kind of making this phone at that moment, it was a very, very nice thing. And I was a big fan of this particular device when it came down to it. You're getting that front-facing camera, pretty much no bezel on the front either. And I thought this was a better design than the Google Pixel 3 and the Pixel 3 XL. Although the 3 and 3 XL were giving you kind of this front-facing, speaker, at least with this phone, the bezels were much more uniformed and it looked like a way better phone. But this phone is pretty much built completely out of plastic, and that was one of the biggest things to kind of keep in mind here. So this particular phone, pretty much a plastic-built phone, nothing much else going for it. On the bottom, you were getting a USB Type-C port, which was actually very nice because at that moment, a lot of devices were basically giving you still like micro USB on budget phones like this. I know a lot of Samsung Galaxy A phones that are basically giving you those budget type of, micro USB ports here too. So it was still very, very nice that you were getting this type of capability here of it not being super cheap and still getting a USB Type-C port in this particular phone. And you were also getting, believe it or not, a particular headphone jack. By this point, a lot of Pixels and some phones were kind of moving away from, the headphone jack. So it was still very nice to have this type of capability on this particular device at that moment, which again was super, super cool. So from that particular perspective, this phone got another thumbs up for me, which again was a very, very nice thing. On the backside, you were getting that single camera setup, which looked great. I love having single camera setup. And you were also getting, the fingerprint sensor on the backside as well, which still was very nice. The front, everything else about this phone was very, very nice. And like I said before, I didn't really have a lot of things to kind of complain about here either. So I do think from that side, it definitely got a thumbs up for me on the exterior. Clearly, this thing is kind of showing its age a little bit, but some things I would say for the most part that this phone is kind of lacking in, that a lot of phones kind of have nowadays. There's a couple of things here. So for one, this device is kind of, missing out on IP certification. So there's no IP certification on this particular phone. There's also no wireless charging or reverse wireless charging on this phone. No 120 Hz or ProMotion displays on this thing either. But I will tell you for the most part, it's not really that terrible of a thing. And I do think for the most part, if you're going through and buying a phone, this thing isn't really that terrible of an experience when it comes down to it. So from that side, it kind of gets a thumbs up for me, from the exterior of this particular phone when it comes down to it. Now on top of that, when it comes down to the other side of things, like the camera, this was one of those things that was kind of hit or miss for some people. So the first thing to kind of keep in mind here was that you're getting this 12.2 megapixel wide angle lens on the back. You're getting an 8 megapixel wide angle camera on the front. Now you were able to do 4K at 30 on the back side, which was great, and 1080p on the front side, which again was a very, very nice touch. And like I said before, if I'm going through and using a phone on an everyday basis, it is actually very nice to have that type of capability. And like I said before, it's some really, really nice stuff. However, there's also some stuff to kind of keep in mind that this phone may not be aging the best in. So for one, this device really isn't going to be doing that great when it comes down to 4K at 60 on the front or back. You're basically going to be missing out on 4K at 60 on the front and back on this particular phone, which again isn't the biggest deal in the world, but if you are using a phone on an everyday basis, that could be one area that you look at that may not be the best thing ever. So kind of keep that in mind. Again, not the biggest deal in the world, but that is kind of one minor thing to kind of keep in mind there. On top of that, this device, when it comes down to social media applications, isn't going to be giving you that great of an experience either. So if you're trying to go through and get a device that's going to be giving you a better experience in those particular ways, well, this device may not be giving you that. And again, that's just one other minor thing to kind of keep in mind here as well. So although this phone isn't like perfect, there's still a lot of things to keep in mind that, it was better than basically the main flagship it was kind of competing with, which at the time was the, Google Pixel and the Pixel 3 XL. So from that side, that's kind of one thing to kind of keep in mind there too. Now, when it comes down to the software side, this was probably one of the better areas of this particular phone, which was actually pretty insane. So I will tell you, this phone was basically matching in line with something like the Google Pixel 3 and the 3 XL at that moment. And this phone was basically supported from Android 9 all the way up to Android 12, which was actually very, very impressive. So the fact that this device was giving you that much, software experience at that moment was actually very, very impressive. And that was a very cool thing going on for this particular device. And I was a very big fan of that. The fact that we were getting that type of capability on this device was very, very cool. And this in and of itself was another very nice thing. Now, this phone basically, as you may have suggested and seen, is basically done getting software support. So if you're expecting this phone to still be supported with software, that is not the case. You are not going to be getting a long-lasting phone from this thing anymore. And that is kind of a sad thing. I wish this phone could have lasted forever, but that just isn't really the case. And you're not going to be getting that much longer of a supported phone on this thing. I mean, it's been outdated with software for basically 2 years now. And, you're kind of done getting software support from this thing as of this point. So keep that in mind. Again, not the biggest deal in the world, but just one of those other minor things to kind of keep in mind here. But when it comes down to the performance side, this device was giving you that Qualcomm Snapdragon 670 chipset inside with 4GB of RAM. The thing I will tell you about the performance, the RAM, everything about this particular device is that it really was not that terrible of a performing device when this phone first came out. I think you have to keep this in mind. There's still a lot of capability and a lot of things to love about a phone like this. And I do think the performance of this thing really wasn't that terrible. And I do think Google did a pretty good job of this phone when it first came out. And even now, it really isn't that terrible. I've definitely had phones that were definitely worse than this thing. And even for a 2019 device, it really isn't doing that bad. The thing I really like and really appreciate about these types of phones is that they're pretty much stock Android, and there's not a lot of craziness going on in the background that it has to run all the time. But I do think one thing you're going to have to kind of keep in mind for the most part is that a device like this, you're definitely going to be experiencing the lack of ProMotion or 120 Hz, maybe some other things across the board here too. But I will tell you for the most part, it definitely gets a thumbs up for me in a lot of different ways. And I'm a very, very big fan of the way this particular phone has held up for the last couple of years. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll definitely tell you is that I like the Google Pixel 3a. I don't know if this would be the first phone I'd recommend people to buy as of this point, but I do think for a device that just kind of has held up so well throughout the last couple of years, it is a device that I'd look at, and I'd probably tell a lot of people to go ahead back in the last couple of years to go and pick up. I probably wouldn't recommend people to buy this phone anymore. The minimum phone I'd recommend people to buy now is the Pixel 5a. I'd recommend going through and buying maybe some other devices here and there too. But as of this point, that's kind of how this device kind of holds up for the most part throughout the last couple of years in 2024. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.